Do people think that you're a loser? I bet that at some point in your life you've wondered that. Do people think of me as a loser? There are times in our lives when we've wondered. Maybe it was when the invitation you gave was turned down. Maybe it was when you had a door slammed in your face. Maybe it was when the company you worked for said that you can no longer work for them. Maybe it was when the person who you thought had your back instead turned their back on you. And wondering if you are a loser is not without effect. So many of the decisions that we make come from a desire not to be seen that way. That's why we keep asking ourselves, does anyone think that I'm a loser? Today we are going to see in John chapter 9 a man who was seen as a loser, and then a winner, and then a loser again, all in one day. He was a man born blind. And you might not think that you could have that much in common with a man born blind 2,000 years ago. But what you share with this man is that he had Jesus in his life, and you have Jesus in yours too. And Jesus helps you to see your life differently. Jesus is going to show you today why you shouldn't think of yourself as a loser, and then why you should. In our first two verses, we see how insensitive at times Christ's disciples were, verses 1 and 2. As he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" They wanted to know why this man was born with a disability. And they assumed that it was because someone had really screwed up. Why did they guess that it was because of sin? Well, it's because they thought that this blindness was the worst thing that could happen to a person. They looked at this man and they thought that if they were blind like he was, that they would feel like such losers. So they wondered how God could let this happen to him. Well, it must be that God's hands were tied. That someone had gone against God and sinned in some horrible way that caused this man to be born blind. It's because they saw his blindness as being so very bad that they assumed that the cause of the blindness was also something very bad. It doesn't have to be blindness. Our affliction can be a medical diagnosis, or a job loss, or even a disobedient child. We dwell and we dwell on it. We let the problem grow in our minds, admiring the problem, as though it were the most important thing about us, as though we are the diagnosis, we are the pink slip, we are the disobedient child. These are all things that we might call afflictions. And afflictions affect us. Afflictions really do affect us. They even affect us before we get them. We get all worried that we're gonna lose the client, and then we're gonna lose the boss's respect, and then we're gonna lose the job. We get all worried that even though this year's taxes didn't turn out too badly, that next year's taxes will turn out very badly. Whether it's afflictions that we have now or that we might get later, our afflictions affect us. And so when his disciples asked him who sinned that led to this man being born blind, Jesus knew that they needed a whole new perspective. So let's look at verse 3 here and see the new perspective Jesus gives. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." In other words, when things are looking dark and scary, don't miss what God is doing. Jesus said that God worked this blindness. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Why did I get cancer? Why did I lose my job? Why did God give me the troubles that I have? Is it because God is far away from me? Is it because his help is distant? Jesus wants you to think of the problem differently. It's then that God isn't far away, but when he's closest to you. Your afflictions might make you feel like a loser. But it's then that you have God working most actively in your life to get you through. In fact, this is why we as Christians love to give real help to people who are feeling alone and afflicted. Because Jesus, the light of the world, calls us the light of the world. So when God draws close to the afflicted, he often does so through our service and our commitment. This blind man, however, he didn't have to wait for God's people to be the light of the world. He had God himself right there with him. Our next verses. After saying this, he, Jesus, spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Think of it from this blind man's perspective. Obviously, he couldn't see, but he could hear. He could hear Jesus' sandals crunching on the dry ground as he walked over to him. The Greek word for spit is, I kid you not, the Greek word for spit is patui. The noise that he heard as Jesus spit on the ground. He heard Jesus mixing the spit with the dirt to make mud. And then he felt the mud covering his eyes. Weird stuff. Sometimes God's help does not look like what we would expect. But the mud of life is often God's cure. Maybe your muddiest problem is really God's tool that he uses to help you. Allow me to submit one example. There's a Christian writer named Tim Chan. And Tim writes about how his affliction was God's way of growing him. Tim suffers from depression. He has a hard time feeling good because depression makes him feel bad. He used to think of depression as this enemy that squeaked past God's defenses to hurt him. But then he realized that through his depression, God was giving him some remarkable gifts. Tim used to tie his value, his personal value, to his work productivity until depression shattered any illusion that he could fulfill his needs through his own work. Tim used to swell up with pride until depression knocked him down so that he found humility in Jesus. Tim didn't know how to show empathy to others until depression made him have to search for God's empathy in the Bible. Now, depression didn't exist before the world fell into sin, but the mud of life is often God's cure. The mud of life is often God's cure. So your afflictions might make you feel like a loser. But when you have depression and God, you're a winner. When you have an unfair boss and God, you're a winner. When you have cancer and God, you're a winner. When you have God, you have the undefeated one in your corner, which means that despite all earthly evidence to the contrary, you are not a loser. You'd think that this man's day was over, that receiving the gift of sight for the first time would be enough excitement for one day. But his day was just getting started. We pick up the text at verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Part of my job of explaining this text to you is bridging the gap between our culture now and their culture then. And I know that there is a gap because I didn't hear any reactions to verse 14 as I read it. We're going to try verse 14 one more time But this time, right after I finish reading the verse out loud, I want this half of the room to say, "How dare!" And I want this half of the room to just gasp loudly. All right, here we go. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath.
How dare!
Yes, this was shocking to them. The Pharisees could not fathom. They could not fathom a good person doing any work, even the work of making mud on God's day of the week, the Sabbath. Why? It's because they had read God's law, which includes the commandment to remember the Sabbath day, and then they built on that law by adding their own rules about what people could and could not do on the Sabbath. Really, they did it because they wanted to make themselves right before God by their own keeping of the law. Let's say you wanted to try to do that. Let's say you wanted to make yourself right by keeping God's law instead of relying on God. Well, if you try that, you soon realize that you cannot do it. So you're left with two options. Either you give up on being your own savior, or you convince yourself that you can do it, as long as you can find other people who are worse than you are. The Pharisees, by adding their own rules to God's law, were making it so they always could find people who couldn't live up to the standard that they had set. Let me bridge the culture gap one more time for you. What the Pharisees were doing is like middle school. Like the Pharisees 2,000 years ago, these days, if you are the first middle schooler to point out who the losers are, you guarantee that you are not one of them. The Pharisees didn't want to be losers, so they made sure that other people were the losers who couldn't keep the rules that they made. That was the power that the Pharisees had as this once blind man was made to stand before them. And as they questioned him, he must have been wondering what their opinion of him was going to be. They would determine if he was a winner in their society or a loser. They held the key to his social standing. What they said about him, it really mattered because it would affect his life. So he could either say the right things and go live the life with eyesight that he always wanted, or he could say the wrong things and be right back where he was at the beginning of the day, being shoved to the outskirts of society. The Pharisees' opinion of him was everything. And that must have made it very difficult for him then when they asked him their next question. Now remember that the Pharisees were wondering if Jesus was good because he helped or bad because he broke their Sabbath rules. Our next verses. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him, about Jesus? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." Verse 34. To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. This man declared that Jesus must be sent from God, a servant of the Lord, a prophet. But those were the wrong things to say, according to the Pharisees. So they came down with a verdict of outcast for him. He had had the chance to criticize Jesus for breaking the Sabbath, but he didn't. And so he went from blind to seeing to shunned, all in one day. Once again, he was a loser. Now, if you were there that day in that moment and you asked this man, was it worth it to stand up for Jesus? Do you think that he would have some mixed feelings? When have you stood before the Pharisees in your life and wanted more than anything not to be a loser? Maybe it was the spiritual conversation that you were supposed to enter into, but you didn't because you didn't want to be seen as a Jesus freak. Maybe it was the home devotion with your family that you were convicted to start, but you didn't because you didn't want things to get awkward at home with religion. Maybe it's the sin that God says to avoid, but would be prudish of you to be so careful about avoiding. Maybe it's the physical boundary that you know that your boyfriend or girlfriend wants to cross, and you don't want to lose them, so you lose something to them. Maybe it's the sin that's easy for you to avoid, but also easy for you to bash other people for falling into. Jesus tells us to follow either God's will or the world's will. And we often fail to make that easy choice for God. Jesus once said, "Whoever loses their life for me will find it, but whoever wants to save their life will lose it." Could it be that we are far more interested in saving face with the world than losing it all for the sake of Jesus? This once blind man, blind, then seeing, then shunned, he was thrown to the curb, and then he was left with a choice. Would he try to get in good again with the Pharisees, even if it meant turning his back on Jesus? Did it matter to him not to be a loser? Or to put it this way, would he use his new eyesight to find Jesus? Or would he use it to get back into the world's good graces? And that's the same choice that you have to make. But that's a tough decision. And Jesus doesn't want you to make it alone. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he, Jesus, found him, the once blind man, Jesus said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Immediately he fell to the dry ground, the stuff that he knew Jesus thought of as good for spitting on, and he worshiped Jesus. He was willing to lose it all for Jesus. Why? Because he knew that Jesus would lose for him. When he was hoisted up on a cross that he had been nailed to, Jesus lost. That's why there is something in this room that should be more shocking to us than Jesus making mud on the Sabbath. It's this cross. Do you know what this is? It's a first century torture device. And now it's the most popular symbol for Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was willing to lose his life on the cross. He considered what you needed to be right with God, and he paid the price. He bled and died for you. He endured the worst that we could give him for you. He felt God the Father turn his back on him for you. He experienced what it's like to be the world's biggest loser for you. So that even if you've been seeking the world's approval more than God's will, God does not see you as a loser. Because he lost, because he was willing to go through that, you to God will never be a loser. You'll never be a loser. This blind man realized something very important. Jesus actually sums it up for us in our final verse. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." As you live in this world, the world that wants to call you a loser, you also hear your Savior beckon to you, "Lose with me." It's okay to lose. Take up your cross and lose, but lose with me. The blind will see, and those who see will become blind. This man's new sight wasn't with his eyes, but with his soul, as he realized that the world's winners are losers, and the world's losers, those are the winners, as long as you lose with Jesus. So the next time that you decide to lose with Jesus and say the thing you need to say, or do the thing that you need to do, and someone says to you, "Hey, aren't you going a little bit overboard with this whole Jesus thing?" Don't you see what you're doing? You can say, I see just fine. I see the truth. I see what matters.